Hello everybody, today I'm going to be talking about the Prince of Nothing trilogy. This is the first part of the second Apocalypse series, the second part being Aspect Emperor, and I'll keep my thoughts spoiler free in this video, but if you want to hear my spoiler filled thoughts, I was in some discussions on this trilogy with Philip Chase, Jimmy from the Fantasy Network, and Raph Blue Taxed. The first one, The Darkness That Comes Before, is over on Philip's channel. The second one, The Warrior Prophet, is here on my channel. And the third one, For the Thousandfold Thought, is over on Raph's channel, and I'll make sure to link all the channels down in the description, as well as those 3 videos. This series is noted for being influenced by Dune, Lord of the Rings, and the First Crusade, and while that's the case, I think it is unique, unlike any other fantasy I've read before, and it is essentially the setup and execution of a holy war and an apocalypse, or second apocalypse, I should say. In the prologue to Book 1, The Darkness That Comes Before, we are 2,000 years prior with the first apocalypse that occurred, and a mysterious no-god force which was causing this, and this high king who was seeking refuge but finds himself amidst a plague. And then fast forward 2,000 years later, there is a school of sorcerers who share a dream every single night of this event that happened 2,000 years prior. And they take this dream as an omen to mean a second apocalypse is going to occur. But unfortunately, sorcerers are frowned down upon from the political and religious elite in this world in present day in this book, in this series. And actually, there are more schools of sorcery than just that one. There are actually multiple political factions and indigenous tribes, and there are also some otherworldly beings and creatures in the series, including some parasitic sex monsters or creatures. And I think it goes without saying, there are major trigger warnings in this series. Major trigger warnings. There is a high amount of sexual brutality towards both men and women, but especially women, I would say. And so I think you need to know your boundaries when you go into this series. It might be too much. He does not shy away from the details. It is quite graphic. And I'll go ahead and circle back to this point maybe later on in the video, but I think that that's worth noting now. And as for the characters, we follow a fairly contained group of characters throughout this series. And I have to say that for characters who lack a large amount of agency, they are some of the best characters I've ever read. I mean, they are so well realized, so fleshed out, so nuanced, so layered. And so you see them in their moments of desperation when the stakes are high, but then you also see them in their quieter moments and the ways in which they argue and banter and joke with one another. I thought that each of the characters contrasted one another, and you'll see some familiar fantasy archetypes with these characters. So for example, you will see a sorcerer who is part of that school of sorcerers I mentioned earlier who share that dream every night. And you see a harlot. There's also a Skilvendi tribesman warrior, and a former concubine who I think serves the role as kind of an innocent in this particular series, and a very mysterious Dunyan man named Kelus, who's able to read people's thoughts by understanding the micro muscles of the face and being able to determine their exact motivations, what they're feeling, maybe even before the person is conscious of their own thoughts and behaviors. And it actually brought to mind, I watched a video not too long ago about free will, and the person being interviewed was talking about if it could ever be the case where we would lack free will if we were able to tell every single little micro expression on the face. And he said that could be a possibility. I thought that was interesting that he said that. I thought, did he read the Prince of Nothing trilogy, or did Bakker get his idea? Where did he get that idea from? I was curious about that. So I thought it was interesting to see that play out in the series, like what happens when somebody can read you in that detailed of a way. And the character arcs in themselves, the way that they end up from book 1 to book 3 was absolutely fascinating. I was just very compelled by these characters, though as Philip said in his review, I'll go ahead and point to that too. He did a wonderful spoiler-free review of this trilogy. The characters are not characters you're going to necessarily love. I don't know, it could vary per reader, but for me, I don't know that I really felt like I loved or was rooting for every single character. I just was fascinated by them. I was fascinated by their struggles. And while each of the characters is very distinct and nuanced and displays various idiosyncrasies, I think each one of the characters grapples with desire and shame in an interesting way. And I think that relates to the larger themes of this series, because I think in this Holy War setup, Bakker is exploring the ways we are driven by these inner impulses and desires and unable to rationalize beyond them or to assert some kind of control or will beyond them. That struggle, that internal struggle with that. And of course, that leads to a lot of conflict and a lot of shame. And you see that. And it's just fascinating the way he was able to capture these nuances in a person. So I thought that that was fascinating character work there. In addition to this contained group of characters, there are several secondary characters, and there are some that are more flat than others, especially secondary characters. So you have characters such as a paranoid emperor, his narcissistic, abusive mother, and I should add to that, narcissistic and arrogant nephew. And I think that they might serve some comedic relief at times, though they are very horrifying to read about as well. And they also drive the plot as well. But I think it was helpful to follow a fairly contained group throughout the trilogy because, as Philip mentioned in his review, Bakker does not shy away from exposition, so you do get a fair amount of detail, especially about the Holy War setup and about the various political maneuverings occurring. And you also get a variety of setting as well. So there is a fair amount of travel explored from book to book, including various holy sites and historic sites and palaces and deserts, just an array of setting. And that said, I think Bakker pulls it off because he is such a skilled writer. He has a very sophisticated way of writing at times, and at the same time, he weaves in the vulgar, so it creates some interesting contrasts. And as for the Holy War itself and the battle scenes, now, with these battle scenes, they're not so much a boots on the ground personal account of battle or a deep psychological experience of battle from a soldier's perspective. They are more of an overview of war. And so you're kind of imagining hordes of people and banners flying and songs and yelling and swords clashing and carnage everywhere and smells as well, as Philip mentioned as well. And I will not go there here, but you do get a lot of vulgar detail. And I think that that might not appeal to some readers as much as the in-depth, personal, intimate exploration of battle, but I think it's effective in creating, again, this atmosphere of battle and giving you as a reader the perspective of how ugly war is. And especially as it's driven, in this case, in a holy war, by zealotry or by religious fervor and by avarice, one or the other. And so I think he's showing you the audacity of war by showing you this broader picture of it rather than making you feel a connection with the soldier in an intimate way. I think it was effective. And at the same time, I do admit that in book 3, that for me was what got a little monotonous. And I know that Philip mentioned also about the pacing issues in the middle of book 3. That was where I felt a little fatigued by the battle scenes. Not that they weren't well written, they were very well written. But Bakker also has a way when he's describing these battle scenes of making it seem like a historical account more than anything. And he describes faction upon faction and lists of people coming from different groups and their different strategies. And while that's, that's kind of interesting, I found myself not feeling very connected to it and having a hard time following it. I don't think he wrote those battle scenes in a way that he meant the reader to memorize every single political group that was involved. It was more, again, to create that sense of atmosphere. But I found myself wanting to go back to our more intimate portrayals of the characters again when we were in those scenes so much in the third book. But again, I think it was effective, especially in portraying the ugliness of war, as I mentioned already, but also questioning whether people even know what they worship and whether people know what drives them. I feel like that's a major question that comes up in this broad macro way through the battle scenes, but also in an intimate way with the in-depth character work. So I did enjoy that micro and macro exploration of that question. And because there were so many questions about these things, for me, I felt as though this trilogy was an invitation towards agnosticism rather than a nihilistic rabbit hole. I know that Philip has mentioned the lack of hope, and there is quite a lack of hope in this trilogy, but I still feel as though I'm being invited to explore my questions about things. I'm invited to explore my certainty about things. That is also brought up quite a bit. And I know that with this particular trilogy at the end, there is a long glossary after the thousandfold thought, at the end of the thousandfold thought. And that actually reframed what I thought about certain things earlier in the trilogy. It actually opened up more doors for wonderment and contemplation. And for that reason, I think I'm very satisfied with how things went. Now, as for the reading experience, I would say with book one, that was a very effective setup and introduction to characters, the setup of a holy war. With book two, that was my favorite book because there were so many powerful, tragic moments. I thought the character work for me in book two was the strongest. I just felt things. I think there are certain scenes that may be etched in the reader's memory for life if you experience that book. And book three was the hardest one for me to wrap my thoughts around. I felt as though I did have more questions than answers at the end. And at the same time, it seemed to end in a satisfying way. It was a mixture of both. So it was a mixture of bringing things to a close while still keeping things open. And to be fair, I'm sure there are several things that happened in book three that went way over my head, that I would have to reread the book several times to fully absorb or understand it. But I did appreciate how much curiosity it left me, especially knowing that there's more. I think had I not known that Aspect Emperor was after the Prince of Nothing trilogy, I might have been a little less satisfied. But because I know there's more to read in Bakker's world, I think it left me with more curiosity, especially with that glossary, because that opened up even more about the metaphysics of this world, which I find so interesting, so fascinating. It's one of my favorite things about the trilogy. And the magic too. I didn't even talk about the magic here, but the magic is otherworldly. It is extraordinary. It feels like heavy metal. It's fascinating. Some of it, again, is very graphic and disgusting, but I think that Bakker does not give you an experience so much to trigger you. I think he's trying to elicit an experience, yes, but I think he's also trying to get us to question things. Now I have to mention that thanks to Jimmy, I did read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy at the same time as I read the third book, The Thousandfold Thought, and that was such an excellent pairing. It was interesting because The Thousandfold Thought opens with a quote from Blood Meridian, and I kind of just set it aside and then read Blood Meridian again alongside The Thousandfold Thought. And then later on, when I looked back at the quote again, I realized it was my favorite quote in this book, which is saying something. But I think that it was interesting knowing that obviously Bakker was influenced by McCarthy. Very different writing styles, but both authors have a way of writing such beautiful passages at the same time as introducing such vulgar, disgusting content. And I feel like it's an interesting contrast to present that which is beautiful and that which is profane, and both authors master that, in my opinion. So I think it was so great to read those two books alongside each other. From here, I'll go ahead and share some of the things that I don't think will work for everyone, and then go into things I think will work for a lot of readers. So this trilogy will not be for everyone, obviously. It's a very specialized type of trilogy, especially because, again, as I mentioned with the battle scenes, as effective as they were, I think some people would rather have a more intimate experience of battle rather than a bigger overview of battle. That will work for some readers. It won't work for every reader. The other thing is the lack of agency that characters experience. I think there's still question about that in my mind, but for the most part, it did seem like characters did lack a lot of agency. And at the same time, like I said, best characters I've ever read for lacking agency. And then the other thing is the lack of female representation. There are 3 female characters in this series, but it seemed like there were far more male characters. That said, I think that especially with one of the female characters in particular that I'm thinking about, I thought was incredibly well written. I was fascinated by her journey. I think that Bakker put a lot of care into this character. And then again, the sexual violence in this trilogy, that is going to be too much for some readers. And I think it's just, again, it's important to know your boundaries when it comes to that content. But now to recap the things that I really appreciated about this trilogy. The first thing being the way that we explore faith or hope versus truth, and the ways in which we as humans don't always know what's driving us, the questions behind that. And again, how that's explored on a micro level with the characters, but also on a macro level with this whole Holy War atmosphere and setup. And the metaphysics of this world were so fascinating for me, especially, I have to admit, with that glossary at the end of The Thousandfold Thought. that just opened up my curiosity even more, especially with the history and lore of this world as it's connected to that. And then I have to mention the characters. Of course, the characters are very flawed and they're very uncomfortable to read about sometimes, especially with their moments of frailty. They do show and display moments of strength, though. And I mean, there are so many different things that Bakker was able to show through these characters. So I quite enjoyed reading about them, even if I didn't feel comfortable about them most of the time. And then the other thing is the magic, which I already vaguely mentioned, but I did mention it more in my book one review. Just interesting, wild sorcery and an interesting limitation to that sorcery as well. And then, of course, the Holy War atmosphere, the biblical vibes, and the battle scenes, which I talked about. And then the intense dramatic moments, the tragic moments, those, especially in The Warrior Prophet, were phenomenal for me. And then Bakker's prose, which just brought everything together. Bakker has a way with words. I think that he captivated me even in scenes that might have not captivated me had it been a lesser skilled writer. Bakker pulls things off in a way that's very effective. And even though this might border on nihilism, this trilogy, it still left me with curiosity and in a state of contemplation and wonder. And I look for that when I'm reading a book. I want to feel like I'm suspended in a state of wonder long after reading the book. And it did that for me. It also made me feel very immersed in the settings and in the character work, as I mentioned, and it made me feel emotions, especially with all the tragic moments that happened. So that is it for now. Please let me know in the comment section below if you're planning on reading this trilogy, if you don't think you'll read this trilogy. If you've read the trilogy, I'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much for watching. Until next time!